advisor.
Right.
Since then, she's been made the ambassador. And I asked you this then, and I think I've asked you on the call-in shows too. What kind of a problem is it for you right now in your position that she is the ambassador to NATO? When you talked earlier, 2003 when we talked, that NATO was upset with this country because we didn't get them involved ahead of time in both Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Well, particularly in Afghanistan, yeah. Well, I'll answer your question very simply. I'm writing a book on China this time. My wife said, I don't want to hear from you on Europe anymore. I mean, because she was in the difficult position when I wrote the book on the U.S.-European relationship, that she was the deputy ambassador at NATO, and here I was stirring up all this, fighting with the Europeans. So this time she said, stop talking about Europe. So in that sense, we haven't had, I don't think I've caused as much trouble for her as I did.
Is the book on China the follow-up to this book here, Dangerous Nation?
No. It's basically something very short. I'm also working on volume 2 of this, but this is sort of more a very narrow, kind of long essay on U.S.-China relations.
How long do you think you'll be in Brussels, and what will you do after that?
I am coming home in August of 2008 to put my kids back in school, and I don't know what I'll do after that, but that's definitely going to happen.
Are you still with the Carnegie Group?
I am. They're very generously continuing to...
Still writing a column for the Washington Post?
Correct.
A little bit more to go on the letter.
Is there more? Was that just a long letter?
It was, but again, the purpose of this is to try to put it in context
Right.
of what this whole group that it ended up serving in the administration wrote in 1998. We urge you, this is a letter to Bill Clinton, we urge you to articulate this aim and to turn your administration's attention to implementing a strategy for removing Saddam's regime from power. This will require a full complement of diplomatic, political, and military efforts. Although we are fully aware of the dangers and difficulties in implementing this policy, we believe the dangers of failing to do so are far greater. How aware were you at the time about the dangers and difficulties of implementing this policy?
Well, obviously, we wound up being surprised by how difficult it was to implement the policy of carrying out the occupation after the intervention. I mean, it was true that the actual military intervention in toppling of Saddam Hussein was, by historical standards, fairly easy. What we did not, obviously, I shouldn't say we, I can only speak for myself. What I did not anticipate was the enormous difficulty, which I think was mostly self-inflicted, that we had in carrying out the post-invasion occupation.
Rest of this paragraph. We believe the U.S. has the authority under existing UN resolutions to take the necessary steps, including military steps, to protect our vital interests in the Gulf. In any case, American policy cannot continue to be crippled by a misguided insistence on unanimity in the UN Security Council. You believed at the time that the president didn't even have to come to Congress to ask for authority to go to war with Iraq.
No, I wasn't. I wasn't saying that. I was just saying that it needed no further. But the point of that is it needed no further UN resolutions. That existing UN resolutions about the enforcement of the peace agreement reached in 1991 permitted the United States to use military force, which was the Clinton administration's view when it did carry out the bombing attack on Iraq.
Final paragraph. We urge you to act decisively. Did he?
He did do that bombing attack, but it proved ultimately, I'm not sure it worked ultimately. We don't know what it destroyed. This is the great mystery. As Bill Clinton himself said before the second Iraq war, we might have gotten all of it, we might have gotten some of it, we might have gotten none of it, we just don't know. So it's possible that a lot of those weapons were destroyed.
If you act now to end the threat of weapons of mass destruction against the U.S. or its allies, you will be acting in the most fundamental national security interest of the country. If we accept a course of weakness and drift, we put our interests and our future at risk. They didn't find any weapons of mass destruction.
Well, they didn't find the stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction that everybody thought that was there. That's correct. I think it's worth pointing out that the weapons inspectors did conclude that Saddam Hussein was absolutely determined to continue his weapons program. They judged that he destroyed a lot of the stockpiles that everybody thought, that no one could explain what had happened to, but that he had ongoing programs which he hoped to restart when and if the containment strategy in the international community began to fail.
When you look back on the whole effort of the project for the New American Century, what was its value? Not just this letter, but the whole project.
It's hard to say. I mean, again, if you think about the fact that we dealt with a very broad collection of foreign policies like the Balkans, like China, I think it expressed a view which I think, particularly for a Republican Party that had gone very much in the other direction in the 1990s, it expressed a view that the United States had a very important role to play in the world still, that we couldn't, just because the Berlin Wall had fallen, we couldn't now come home and behave as if we were no longer the world's leading power. That was the main message of the Project for the New American Century. It was the main message, I think, of people like myself who argued for a strong and determined and principled American foreign policy. And by the way, in those years and even today, I always felt that I had strong allies in this view among many Democrats, many Clinton administration officials, who also used force quite frequently, as it turns out, during the Clinton administration, whether it was Haiti or Somalia or Bosnia or Kosovo. There was a strong belief, as Madeleine Albright said, that the United States was the indispensable nation and that our power ought to be used for good ends. There's a lot of people who no longer want to remember that was a Democratic foreign policy in the 1990s.
But as you sit here in 2007, have you decided who you're going to support for 2008?
I think I'm linked up with John McCain, at least in an informal sense. I think he's the most courageous, and I think he's the most competent. I mean, what I think we absolutely must have in our next president, regardless of who it's going to be, is real ability to do things competently. I think we have suffered so much in Iraq, for instance, in terms of the way the rest of the world views us, not so much because of what we did, but because of how poorly we did it. It's one thing to do things that people disagree with. It's another thing to do it and then mess it up. America has suffered grievously by the failure of execution.
Andrew Coburn was here last week, and he's written a book on Rumsfeld called Rumsfeld, and he's quite critical. I'm not sure you're the right one to answer this, but here is what he said about Don Rumsfeld.
Rumsfeld was definitely one of the worst, if not the worst, Secretary of Defense in history. I mean, his rival for that title is obviously Robert McNamara, but in all sorts of areas, although they ended up with disastrous wars on their hands, which they'd helped create, McNamara in many ways was a much more competent official than Rumsfeld turned out to be.
Well, what do you think?
Well, I'm not big on, world's greatest, most failed Secretary of Defense. I mean, everybody isn't thinking about every Secretary of Defense who ever existed. But I do think that Rumsfeld's policies, I think he's a good man. I think he did what he thought was right. But I think his very stubborn clinging to a policy over several years that was clearly failing, was his failure. I can say, it's perfectly reasonable to say, this is my approach. This is the strategy I want to try in Iraq. But then, when it's not working, and clearly not working, you have to have the willingness and the flexibility, and intellectual flexibility, to say, okay, it's now time to try something else. But he stuck doggedly, year after year. It was clear after 3 months that we didn't have enough troops in Iraq, and he refused to change course. And I think that's a tragedy, and it's a real tragedy for the United States because the price has been very high.
Well, you're in a position maybe to help us understand this. Did Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney through this process walk lockstep? Were they in agreement?
I'm not going to share whatever insights my wife has on things in the government. I think that's
I'm looking for your insight.
Well, my insight is unfortunately shaped by what I know about what's going on. Look, there's no question that I don't think that the vice president would make a secret of this. That he was very close to Don Rumsfeld, and I must say, I think there were times in this administration when personal relationships tended, unfortunately, to trump wise, strategic, and tactical decision-making. The gap and chasm that opened up between the two camps in this administration, the Powell camp on the one hand and the Rumsfeld camp on the other, I don't think it's a secret anymore, paralyzed decision-making. It became much more about this tug of war than about how do we get this thing right in Iraq. And I think that is a tragedy, and I think, everyone has some share of the blame for it.
Well, as you know, in history, a lot of secretaries of state and secretaries of defense in the same administration have differed greatly. Yes. Is that good or bad government?
It's okay if there is ultimately someone at the top willing to say, okay, gentlemen or ladies and gentlemen, I've heard your opinion, but this is where I'm going. And I think the interesting model, and I don't want to glorify the Reagan administration because I worked in the Reagan administration, and there were many times when it was a mess. And there was a real feud between George Shultz and Caspar Weinberger.
And you worked for George Shultz.
And I worked for George Shultz. But at the end of the day, Reagan would ultimately, in almost every case, say, okay, I've decided to go this way. Shultz and Weinberger argued about what to do with the Soviet Union. Reagan sided with Shultz. On other issues, he sided with Weinberger. You need a system where ultimately a decision is made. And I think the problem here was it was mostly inertia driving things rather than anybody at the top saying, this isn't working, let's go fix it.
Who do you think in the administration, President Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, others, wanted to go to war more than anybody else?
Well, I think that the president was the most determined to go to war. I don't know, we'll never know, or maybe we won't know for decades until all kinds of documents are released, whether, for instance, Cheney was as enthusiastic about going to war as the president was. My recollection of Cheney throughout the 90s, and even I think in the campaign of 2000, was that he did not think it was necessary to remove Saddam Hussein. At least he wasn't an enthusiastic supporter of that idea.
What was his attitude back during the Gulf War in '91?
No, in the Gulf War in '91, he took a very strong position that we had to respond. He was on the side of those. Powell was the one.
No, but I mean, should we have gone all the way? Did he think we should
No,
go
I
back?
think, as far as I know, there was no real dissent in the top ranks of the first Bush administration about going on and getting Saddam Hussein.
Show you what Andrew Coburn said about his opinion of the whole war, and then get your response.
Okay.
Clearly, I mean, retrospectively, it's been a huge disaster. And it's been a disaster because it was all entered into so casually. It was so, I mean, not just Rumsfeld. I have to take slight issue with Senator McCain here. I mean, it seemed clear to me from fairly early on. I mean, even before it started, that first of all, it was all based on a lie. Because of a previous book I'd done on Saddam Hussein, I knew there were either no weapons of mass destruction whatsoever, or, a few token sort of decaying, rusting warheads at most of chemical weapons. It was clear to me there was no nuclear program. In fact, there was plenty of evidence. It wasn't very hard to find that. I mean, there were Iraqi nuclear scientists out in the world who could tell you that. So it was all based on a lie. And that Saddam was no threat to man or beast outside his country.
That's the antithesis of what your letter said, the Project for the New American Century, and what do you think of what Mr. Coburn said?
Well, it's absurd, and it's just, he's taking, it's unfortunate because I think I agree with some of the things he says, but then he has to say that it was based on a lie. The notion that this administration went to war based on a lie that it knew that there were no weapons, but it made it up anyway, is one of the dumbest theories I've ever heard. If that were true, who would say, as president, I'm going to go in, pretend that there are no weapons of mass, that there are weapons of mass destruction, invade, then there won't be any weapons of mass destruction, so I'll immediately be exposed as a liar. I'm glad that Mr. Coburn can say that he knew all along that there were no weapons of mass destruction. There was not a single weapons inspector who would have said that or could say that. Even right up until the very end, Hans Blick said there were stockpiles that are unaccounted for. The intelligence services of France and Germany, as well as the United States and Great Britain, all believed that he had those weapons and was building those weapons. And in fact, the people who argued against going to war in 2003 were not saying that Saddam doesn't have weapons. They were saying this is the wrong way to deal with it. In fact, they said he does have weapons, but we can deter him from using them. No one at the time argued we shouldn't go to war because he doesn't have weapons. Even Al Gore, who opposed the war, said in 2002 that his understanding was that Saddam Hussein had weapons scattered all over Iraq. And so that part of it is just absurd and unnecessary. You can talk about the failure of this war without creating a fantasy that there was a diabolical lie at the heart of it. You could just say, if you feel this way, that it was a terrible error. Not the first, I want to say, in American history, and I dare say not the last.
It struck me that the Coburns, Alexander, Patrick, and Andrew,
Wow.
I have a family not unlike yours.
Slightly
Donald,
on different
Fred,
side.
exactly. And I want to just extend an invitation to you and the Coburns so we can get all 6 of you together at some point to talk about the world. We have plenty of time to do that.
That sounds delightful.